Welcome to the show. This is episode 5 of the NeuroMarvels. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Gwen Palafox, a neurotypical psychologist who has a bunch of fun with Dr. Dana Waters.
I have fun too, and I'm Dr. Dana Waters. I am an autistic psychologist, and I can't believe it's episode 5 already. How did we get to episode 5?
I mean, when you're having fun, time flies.
Yeah.
Hey, so today we wanted to do something a little different. You know, we've been hitting some kind of heavier topics lately, and we wanted to have a little fun today by talking about Moon Knight.
Yeah.
Really, you know, and the psychological themes and topics and ideas that I think Moon Knight really, really hits. And so, I don't know, Dana, you want to take it?
Yeah, you know, I thought about it when we were mulling over topics, and I did finally watch that. For those that don't know what this is, it's a Marvel character, right? It's based in the Marvel comic books. It doesn't sandwich in the other Marvel movies that people are probably familiar with like the Iron Man and those kinds. But it's on Disney. It's a six part. I think it's 6 episode. You can watch it on Disney Plus, and it's really a character study about a guy named, at least initially, Stephen Grant, right? Which I thought was kind of funny because I think isn't that the name of the guy who's in Jurassic Park? Isn't Dr. Grant?
Stephen Grant? I think so. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. But it leads us through. I don't want to give a lot away, but you can read about it and know that the character is what we used to call multiple personality, and we call now dissociative identity disorder. And the reason we decided to talk about this on a podcast that's about autism and neurodiversity was that one of the aspects of this character really could fit into a neurodiverse lens, right? Mm-hmm. So we thought we could talk about a little bit about DID, dissociative identity disorder, a little bit about one of his alters, what we refer to them as one of his personalities as separate people in him, if you will, as probably being on the spectrum. And then there's just a lot of theme of balance. Do things balance in your life and so on. That kind of archetype seems to permeate throughout the whole movie. And that's certainly something we've talked about in the first 4 episodes to some level, right? Yeah. How do you, as a person moving through the world, how do you balance various aspects of your life? And sometimes we deliberately think about those balances, and other times we don't, or they get our attention when we're not balanced, right? That's more, you just recently went on a vacation and hit the reset button, and a lot of times, you know, that's how we get balance, or eating well or exercising or whatever. So there's all kinds of things I think that we can pull thematically into it. That and the fact that the series is just unbelievably outstanding to watch. Visually,
it's visually
story's strong. It's just, there's a lot of cultural aspects to it that Disney did a lot of research on and are very grounded in expertise with folks. And they did a lot of research on autism and DID and represented it really well. I mean, I've seen so many movies and TV shows that do it in just this stereotyped, icky sort of way, and they did a really good job with it.
Yeah. Kind of going back to that balance too piece. You know, the idea of the role of stress in one's life, you know, and how do you manage that stress? Are you aware of that stress? How do you manage that stress? And when the stress becomes overwhelming, bigger than yourself, you know, now we're really, you know, flirting with trauma pieces and what that does for a psyche. You know?
So that's the antecedent, if you will, to someone who dissociates, right? I mean, most people at least have a basic idea what dissociation is. It's that feeling of kind of floating out of your body when something really horrible is happening, or not being attached to affect while something bad is happening. And I think we talked about that in here, the difference between dissociation and shutdown. So what happens in dissociative identity disorder is it happens when people are younger. So I have yet to hear of a case where someone would develop DID who went through trauma as an adult, right? Yeah. So the idea is, and we've touched on complex trauma in other episodes, is trauma that's somewhat chronic, somewhat episodic, and happens over early and formative parts of the lifespan, so that they really do, it gets entrenched in personality again, like we've talked about with complex trauma. But with DID, the trauma is so overwhelming, and or the person who's going through this, the coping mechanisms they're using to deal with it aren't working. And so what someone actually does is they start to parse off an aspect of themselves, right? And that's why we call it a multiple personality. Now, we all have aspects of ourselves. I'll do work with folks that I learned in doing psychodrama that's called parts work. And I always have to preface this with, I'm not saying you're DID. We all have aspects like our work self and our self with friends, and the self that geeks out on Marvel movies and that kind of thing, right? But we're aware of those selves, and we can flip back and forth between those things all the time. In DID, these are really in and of themselves fully formed personalities that are not necessarily aware of each other. Now, sometimes people can be DID and aware that they have alters or separate selves, but more often than not, they're not aware of it. And then the long-term work becomes having them become aware of it, and then doing what we call integration work so that the parts are aware of each other. So in the movie, this is happening at the beginning, and the main character doesn't know this. One alter knows, but the other doesn't, that there's more than one person in there. And so what you see in DID are things like, and I've worked a lot with folks that are DID, where the shift isn't like it is in the movies, and they do an effect in the movie where his kind of eyes roll back and you hear this weird sound, and then he goes into another personality, and that's really more for effect. It's usually a little bit more subtle than that, but folks do talk about losing chunks of time. Like in the movie, there's one thing where he thinks it's Friday and it's really Sunday, and he's really disturbed by what happened to, Saturday.
His date, or his poor date. Yeah, he missed his date, right?
He misses his date. And so those kinds of things, those kind of cues. And if this has happened from an early age, just like autism, people learn to mask. People learn to hide it. Don't tell others about it. And if it's not super severe, like you'd see in some, the person is depicted in the really old movie Sybil, which is a really excellent movie to watch still, although it's dated. People can actually function fairly well, or they don't function at all. These are folks that will come to you, haven't been able to hold a job down. As you can imagine, losing chunks of time, losing access to certain parts of your memory could be problematic in a workplace and things like that, right? Yeah. What I think they do a really good job in the movie is, while one alter is doing these crazy things, the other one thinks that they're dreams, right? So one will fall asleep and the other will wake up thinking that he's sleptwalked all night, or that he's just had these crazy dreams, right? And I've actually had a client that was similar to that, where they initially thought these were just dreams, or other people were teasing her, saying, why don't you remember this, that, or the other thing? And she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And it wasn't until later that she would hear those sorts of things from her parents that they were somewhat concerned, but she was functioning well enough to not know about it until she was in her 30s, till she came to see me. Wow. And then you see these really subtle things like, the person I was used to working with for a long time, little things like coming to session dressed differently, carrying themselves differently. The voice might be a little bit different, right? And something just isn't quite the same. And then you start to talk to them. And if you mention names and things like that, they might actually use different names if they're somewhat integrated. Or in the case of Moon Knight, you've got Mark, who's the other side of Stephen's character, who does know that Stephen exists. Yeah. Stephen doesn't know Mark exists at the beginning. And that's pretty typical too, where you'll have one alter who is kind of, or at least the managing alter, the one in charge, who knows about the other ones, right? But this is really the psyche's way of dealing with really difficult trauma that kids are not equipped to cope with, right? Yeah. So we've talked about masking, and that's a coping strategy, right? If we all went out into public and did exactly what we wanted, it'd be pandemonium. And we've talked about autistic masking, where trying to fit into like NT norms and those kinds of things, neurotypical norms. And if you can think about DID, might be like a version of that on steroids, right? But it really is adaptive, and it's meant to protect the psyche from things that are too awful to know and deal with and see all the time, right?
Yeah.
So
especially when, as a child, right? You know, if the trauma or the abuse is coming from your parent, you know, you depend on your parents for survival.
That's right.
So how do you cope with that? When that is so unsafe and scary and unpredictable and volatile. You know, what do you do as a child? So not only do you not have the cognitive resources or the emotional resources because you haven't been on the planet for too long, right?
Right.
You have not built those skills, right? You have to, there's this piece of power and control and having to depend on your parents. And if you, in your mind, if your parents are what's good and right, what does that make you? I'm not really sure.
You bring up a really good point. And that's that kind of inescapability of it, right? Because when you're a kid, you're trapped, right? Yeah. There's no other way to deal with it. And that brings up that really important part. And in therapy with anybody, we talk about various ways we trap ourselves. So like, you haven't taken a vacation in a really long time, or you're not, you know, therapists are always self-care. And you're like, yeah, okay. There's a reason we talk about those things, because it brings balance to those systems, right? That sense of, if you're going to burn out and give a lot of energy for things, you actually do need to have that time to reset to get that balance, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and what, you know, the other topic or theme that we inevitably have hit in every single episode is the importance of self-awareness. You know, the ability to know yourself, your own self-knowledge. How does that self-knowledge then lead to what you do, right? How do you manage yourself? How do you make decisions versus be in this reactive place? You know, I think, you know, poor Steven, I mean, because I immediately felt like I liked him. Yeah. And I felt for him. Yeah. And how scary it was for him to be in these situations of immense stress, immense threat, and not really have the skills in his mind to be able to do anything with that. Like, wow, how disorienting for him.
Yeah. And that just that theme in general about if you're out in the world and you don't feel like you have the skills to deal with something, what do you do? You know, who do you turn to? And so you do see this character sort of segueing into where we can say he does seem like he could be on the spectrum. He does seem like he could have autistic traits or be autistic in his attempts to understand Egyptian mythology. He's totally obsessed with it. You know, he's learning Egyptian alphabet, you know, old alphabet, learning about the Egyptian gods, to the point where he's correcting the people at the museum for a poster that he knows they did wrong, which he's right? But we see these depictions of that coming up against the social norm of the museum, and that people getting irritated by that sort of thing. Like, oh, I know a lot about this, and the poster's wrong. And I've had a lot of experiences like that, right? Where, and autistics do in general, if we really know a topic really well, it feels like you're going to jump out of your skin if you can't correct something. And the work then becomes, you know, this proverbial new phrase that I've heard that I love, is this the hill I want to die on? You know, what is the reason to say this? Is this really the time or place for it? And that gets really hard to gauge. And that's a lot about learning some of those social scripts. When is it good to say this and not say that? And I'll joke with my colleagues, and we're in a meeting, and I'll say, yeah, I know I seem like I might be impulsive when I come in and talk about stuff, but for everything I actually say, there's like 10 things I haven't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You're like, actually, it's very controlled. It's a very controlled me. I
Exactly.
mean, Dana, you bring up impulse control. I mean, impulse
Mm,
control means that you have an awareness of who you are in the context that you're in,
yeah.
and that you've already done some cognitive work with what the potential outcomes could be. And I mean, it's
Exactly. Yeah.
tiring. I mean, I
It's
think that's why
exhausting.
masking
Yeah.
can be so exhausting, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And that it's hard to stop the brain, the braking
Yeah.
system of the brain being like so in the front of our brain, the very kind of
Yeah.
more developed parts of our brain, if you will. That
Right.
braking system is something that I think really builds over time. Like you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have that early on when you're little.
Yeah, yeah. If we're talking about being autistic when you're little or DID, that really it's essential that some sort of, we use these phrase skill building, and it can kind of sound to me. I always like, oh, skill building. It sounds derogatory and kind of infantilizing, but it's not meant to be. It's meant to be. It's not like, well, it could be something literal, like you need to brush your teeth every day. That's a skill you can build, if someone isn't doing that. It can also just be like that thing, like, for every 10 thoughts you have, you want to weigh them in your head and figure out which one is most salient, and you don't have to say the other ones.
Yeah.
But then there's all these other layers of that, like, then do I feel fully seen? Am I really presenting my true self forward, right? And then, so I'm not, being DID is actually still very rare compared to just about everything else that's in the DSM.
Mm-hmm.
Being autistic is less rare. But what isn't rare at all is just humans having this constant, again, that balance of how much of me do I put out there, especially if you're like really passionate about something, excited about something. How much of that do I put out there? And how can I find other people that will humor me and let me do my thing, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure Steven ends up getting that job at the museum because he's so interested in these things, thinking everybody else will be too. But when you're a gift shop manager or a security guard, you don't care. Probably if he would actually been able to talk with archaeologists, they would have been able to
Right.
geek
Or a
out together.
docent or like
Oh
a,
yeah,
right.
exactly. Yeah. If he
Right.
really wants to
Yeah.
be a docent, they won't let him. He's not dependable enough. He doesn't get to work on time enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it's important, like, for us, just in the context of this episode anyway, to say, DID and autism, their origin stories are different.
Right. Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we know that autism is a neurological thing, right? What we do know is that the vast majority of people who are autistic have traumatic symptoms at some point, and that's more having to do with living and being this creature that isn't in a pond that's friendly to you, right? So in this neurotypical world, that's stressful. Being uber wired to all these sensory inputs is stressful. So we do tend to. I've yet to work with someone who is autistic that doesn't even at least have some of that. Whether they reach a whole deep PTSD diagnosis, not necessarily, but certainly have those trauma things.
Yeah.
Whereas DID really is this massive, really elaborate, really entrenched way to cope with, like you said, early trauma, inescapable trauma, and trauma that the child feels like they have absolutely no efficacy over, right?
Yeah.
And that's also why one of the pieces in working with kids and adults who are autistic is, how do we put you in the driver's seat? I mean, it's some of that's deliberate because we're trying to get at that central focus of not being in control that is at the base of so many things we see in the DSM, right? Anxiety things and all these other things. But how do you do that in a way that isn't, controlling with a capital C, where now you've got control issues? How do you do that, right? I always
Yep.
use the analogy with my clients about, I've never actually been surfing, but I've body surfed waves. But this is how I imagine surfing, right? Is it's the perfect mix between having efficacy, controlling your own body because you're controlling balance, you're deciding what wave to take, you're deciding how long to stay on the wave, but you really have to have that efficacy to stand up and stay balanced. But you can't control which wave is going to come. You can't control how big it's going to be. You have to ride with the wave. You can't make the wave go in a certain direction. And that's that, again, that balance piece. And that's really a lot of what life is like. How much can I control? How much can't I control? Right. And it's this proverbial, Jung talked about yin and yang, and this idea of ebb and flow is in almost every culture at the base of it, and it's really about
Yep.
that idea of balance. Yeah.
Yeah. Balance. And, another thing that, this reminds me of, I speak to my clients a lot about that kind of range of comfort.
Yeah.
We spoke about this, and we touched upon this when we were talking about masking and sensory insensitivities, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of, do you understand what your range of comfort is? And when you're at the edges or outside of that range of comfort, that is by consent or with consent is what I should say.
Yeah, that's a good way to put
Right? So this is something that I see in a lot of young adults that have had ABA and they have the profile of the overly compliant, quiet, friendly, sweet kind of individual who then does really weird things, right? Like really gentle and friendly at school and in the community, and then goes home and has a meltdown.
Yeah.
Blows.
Yep.
Is maybe aggressive with just their parent, let's just say.
Yeah.
And it's like, we didn't amplify their voice in regards to what they were able to comfortably do throughout the day and maintain and sustain throughout the day, right?
Right.
They don't even know that because they're just told what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's so, and I think anybody can relate to that to a certain degree,
Yeah.
Especially if you're someone that's living and working in systems that are not set up for you and that you're not the one with the privilege in the system. It starts to tick all the boxes of why you end up doing that to kind of just get along. I was thinking of our family. I grew up in Chicago, and we had a place in Florida, and we'd drive down there every year. Me and my two sisters and my mom and dad's 5 of us in a car. And I would always have to go to the bathroom before anybody else. And my parents didn't respond to that well. I can remember being in tears, like sitting on my foot so I could not, wet my pants. And that's an example of what the opposite of what you're talking about, where we have to. And so that taught me to ignore bodily reactions. And I spent years in therapy trying to get that back. That idea of, how do you know something is going on with you and voice it and have that agency to be able to do those things. And I think that in the Moon Knight series, the character sort of goes through that period of time. The Stephen Grant character goes through a period of time where he doesn't have that efficacy at all.
Yeah.
And then it flips to where he's actually the expert, which is really cool. And won't tell you how that happens because it would totally give it away.
Yeah.
But he really comes into his own, right? In terms of, I do know some of these things and I can be the one to lead the way. And he, in fact, is the one that knows the integration needs to happen, whereas the other alt is afraid of that and wants to shut it down.
Yeah.
There's so much about that that comes into parenting in general. Like, how late should I let my kid stay up? As I went to bed at 7. Should I make my kid to go to bed at 7? All of those sort of rigid systems wanting to do it the way they did it versus what you're talking about, which is harder. Let's listen to our family's rhythms. Let's listen to that child's rhythms, and maybe they can go to bed later because it's summertime, and all of that is that. But you have to be aware of that need to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So that's the kid that has to speak out at school and say, "I'm fried," or even recognize signs of being fried before they get home and then have the meltdown with their parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, kind of going back to sensory sensitivities that we did in episode 2, the
Yeah.
idea of like sometimes those body connections, they're not there, or maybe they're
Yeah.
a little faulty. And it's like helping someone understand, gosh, when I see, and I was working with a client who had a traumatic brain injury.
Mm.
And one of the cues that he was giving off later, and he had this traumatic brain injury in his teens. So
Mm.
it was a significant loss, for this family, because,
Sure.
you have a pretty neurotypical, healthy, child developing, and then a brain injury happens, and then the world dramatically changes after.
Yeah. Yeah.
But drooling was something just kind of
Oh,
like, and
yeah.
he missed those cues completely. And those parents were like, listen, when this happens, we've got to stop. Like, we've got to go home.
Yeah.
We've got to and that was really, really hard, to hear.
Mhm.
But really this idea of the challenge, I think, of being self-aware, the challenge of being able to, what kind of efficacy or control do you have over your environment, especially if you're
Yeah.
a little one who's really
Yeah.
completely dependent on your parent in so many ways.
Yeah.
And that, the safety is not there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Emotional
Right.
safety is not present. So how do we
Mhm.
kind of actualize, evolve, form identities, et cetera, under those conditions,
Yeah, and what
Um,
comes to mind when you're talking about safety, especially with autistic kids and even with adults, is a lot of times more stressed. Language isn't doesn't go well. We lose
yeah,
words. We don't know how to put it
yeah,
into words. So it sort of is a setup for that. So we really do need to rely on other people in our systems to help us with that, just like you're talking about. So it just as much training for parents or caregivers or with adults, friends, and family about it. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that difference of like, I call those like suppressor
Yeah.
variables, like,
Yeah.
just because someone can speak beautifully and articulately,
Mhm.
when they lose the ability for language, that's usually a flag that they're distressed,
Something's going on. Yeah. Yeah.
right? Something's
Yeah.
going on. So that
Yeah.
idea of just because it can happen one day or 1 hour doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
mean that that's going to be a consistent kind of skill or ability that's demonstrated. That idea between skill and performance deficits, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how
Yep.
do we look at the difference? Yeah, they know how to do it. In these conditions, though, they can't perform it, right?
Right.
It's
And it,
that performance is
yeah.
suppressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that sort of is like what goes on with the character in Moon Knight as well. He switches back and forth between these two selves because one can't do the other thing
Yep.
necessarily. And so
Yep.
there's a non-noticeable version of that in those of us that aren't DID. It sort of fluidly happens, or it doesn't, like you said. There are other cues to that. Like I can't put into words what I'm feeling, or like for me, it's picking my thumb cuticle till it's actually bleeding, and then I can say, "Oh, I wonder what's happening right now." I've learned to use that as a barometer.
Nice.
Wow, I've really, oh, okay, I must be stressed right now. And it seems sort of simple, but it'll happen before I'm like, oh, I spent 3 days. Wow, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
learning those things about yourself, right?
Yeah.
Makes so much sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Makes so much sense. Yeah, there's some wonderful pieces. I mean, I think throughout, and Oscar Isaacs, right?
Oh, he's awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
Is just, he does such an amazing job. And I think when you said, in the different alters, there's a different, maybe
Hmm.
articulation or language prosody. We hold ourselves differently, we dress ourselves differently, and
Yeah. Yeah.
there's lots of different pieces, without spoiling anything of the show, where if you really, I think that show really pays you in dividends if you pay
Mm.
attention,
Yeah.
because there's so many details, so
Yeah.
many things that they didn't let go of.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
um
that's what I loved about it so much. I've watched the whole thing twice.
mhm.
And picked up a bunch of things the second time, and then also knowing about the sort of care that Disney puts into stuff like this. that you or I would probably never even notice unless it was pointed out to us, that makes it more rich, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and more believable, and actually a little bit more accurate. The other main theme of the movie is this kind of juxtaposition between good and evil, or what we think is good and evil, really. So there's there's more dichotomies. There's these two dichotomies that we could see both as evil or bad, because they both judge others, but one wants to judge others after the fact, and then one wants to judge others before they even do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the rationalizing that makes sense to either of these two characters, the moral higher ground that they're rationalizing to themselves, like, this is okay because of this, and this. It just reminds me a lot of what's going on in our culture right now around pressing of your own value on another person, or not seeing kind of cultural nuances that lead into someone doing something, or that they're not living in a vacuum. There's this primordial ooze that they belong to because they've grown up in it, and it's part of who they are.
Yep.
And how do those aspects of ourself coexist? This idea of congruence comes to mind, which I spend a lot of time talking about with people in therapy, and I did on my own journey, is what is really true to me, and can I really be true to myself when I don't know who I am in the first place? Which that the movie really explores that as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think every character in that movie, with the exception of Steven, at some point, at least for me, I hated them, and then I was like, oh wow, I could see that. Like, even the bad guys, you're like, oh wow, yeah, there's a piece of truth in that. So that sense of that. And then what we haven't touched on yet is they do again, don't want to give away too much because it's so awesome to watch. There's a depictions of therapy in there, like institutionalized therapy.
Yes.
That are both shockingly real and shockingly scary at the same time.
Yeah.
They sort of did a really good job of what it would look like in an asylum in the 50s, right? But then also a lot of what was going on in there is kind of things that you would do with someone who might be DID, and the person who's a therapist is actually sort of soothing and comforting, but he's also the bad guy. So you're like, what? So they actually even give you the experience of that duality. That you, as the watcher, you're like, but I'm supposed to hate this guy, but he's being really nice. And that kind of takes it to another meta level in the movie, where you, as the viewer, get to know what that feels like to have that duality, right?
Yeah.
And we're dealing with that every day of our lives, all the time, right?
And the other piece too is, like, everyone believes they're doing good. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Everyone, and I feel like that is a narrative that we live in today, right? And it's because we don't understand. You had put primordial ooze. What is the lived experience of this person? There are reasons why people make the decisions they do, why they behave they do. Do they always fully consciously understand those and know those? Maybe not. But there's a reason. There's a reason why. If you look at the main characters, they all believe they're doing good.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
And through whatever means necessary, right?
Right.
It's just there's a disagreement about the means, right? Before or after, you do judge someone before the crime's done or after, and that's been a really, there's been multiple movies that have done that. What Minority Report, was it?
Yeah,
Dana, I think was one, right? Like, is that an ethical thing?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's super interesting to me.
What's so much a reflection of what's going on today in our world. There's so much polarity, and we've touched on this on other episodes too. You have to be able to get yourself in the shoes of the other person. You may not agree with them. That may not be the stance that you want to take, but you have to be able to yoke with that lived experience, like you said. And so if we sort of circle this back even to talking about autism, that has to be central tenet to everything, is to know what that person is living with, going through, and not just impose your will on the other person, knowing that sometimes you need to be able to do that to a certain extent because you're helping them and you're trying to give them skills and teach them things and so on. And then we come to that balance again, where does that balance? One of the true antagonists of the film says, well, if we would get rid of people before they did something evil, we would have stopped Hitler. And that line was like, oh yeah. That line for me, when he said that, was kind of like, oh, he's got a good point there. So there is that seeing the other, maybe not, you don't agree with the whole gestalt, but we do that as humans. We tend to get so entrenched in our own ideas that we can't even see and relate to the other person at all. We think if we don't agree with them in total, we have no common ground. And that's just not true, right?
Yep.
You can have common ground.
It's exactly why, and it's exactly why I loved Wicked as a musical, is it gives you this story about how Glinda, the Wicked Witch of the West, why she looked like, or why she had this reputation, right? Why other people perceived her this way. But the story is all about her lived experience, really, up until, what we know about her, which is, putting a house on Dorothy, but or the aunt or whatever. But, this to me is so critical, like this understanding, right? And it's really why you and I, in many ways, we're very motivated to do a podcast together. It's how do we bring, as two psychologists from two different neurological, and I don't mean to be so categorical about it, but with, different neurological profiles, how do we come together to understand and hold with curiosity and fun? Like today's a fun way to look at psychological concepts, psychological themes, how do we do that in a non-judgmental way? And I think, judgment is making decisions with limited pieces of information. And a lot of times those are from our biases. I mean, in our training, Dana, how much encouragement and exercise did we have in analyzing our own biases? Our own personal biases before we get into therapy.
And
what are our assumptions?
It's supposed to be there all the time.
All the time.
Exactly.
All the time. Right. Because our job is not to tell people what to do. Our job is to help people understand themselves so that they can make informed decisions and choices about their life. And that doesn't change with someone who is neurodivergent.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It's the same concept. And that's, I said this the other day to a family. I was like, just because he is not able to communicate his thoughts, his desires, his wants freely, easily, doesn't mean he doesn't have them.
That's right.
Right? So how do we amplify that voice in however way that voice can come?
I love that, because our part of our culture is like in a hurry. I found myself, we were watching a baseball game the other night, and they had a guy over here talking while the game was going on. And I was laughing, and I said to my wife, I said, he's one of those people that just talks a little bit too slow. Everything is just a little, but it's not like super slow where you could say speed up. It was just on the edge of that. And I was like, find myself getting really irritated. I'm just say it. So there's even like those kinds of things that happen within us that we do judge. We were given and we evolved to have this thing of judgment, mostly like to keep us alive, right? We can judge dangerous scenarios and things like that. And we make judgments all the time, every day. It helps us get through our day without being crippled and paralyzed because we're overwhelmed by everything. To deliberately sit back from that and not rush to the judgment or have our idea of what's going on be so rigid that we can't see anything else, right?
Yep.
I've been working with a client whose sibling doesn't believe abuse happened to them when they were younger. And my mind is sort of blowing around that, because I said, well, what? It's not their trauma, it's yours. Who the heck, so that's an example of such rigidity, and I'm going to put this box around you, and because I don't believe it, it doesn't exist. I mean, that's like the ultimate judgment, right? You cease to be because of how I see you. And that's what happens with marginalizing and assumptions and biases and all the yucky stuff that we've talked about. Certainly, someone has an archetype in their head about what it means to be autistic, or I need to give my child more time to literally say what they need to say. And then, the frame for that. And so our listeners might say, oh, God, well, Dana would get really irritated by someone talking slow. No, that was a guy on TV during a baseball game, right? They're supposed to be if I was working with someone and they needed that time, just like you said, I was trained in school to say, it's not about you, Dana. It's not on your time. Sit back and let them speak. So all of those pieces to give room for the other to be genuinely who they are. And then wonderful things happen. And then the movie does that too. And these two characters do start to see each other and know about each other. And then you realize as the viewer, and they do too, that they would be incomplete with only one or the other. And the two of them is greater than the sum of the parts, to use that old saying. It's sort of a beautiful thing, right?
Yeah. And it's really cool to see alters in their own bodies. Like, to me, it was, because usually it's so, it's more symbolic, right? It's not tangible. So to be able to see that, or just the way that alters were represented in mirrors, how that was so fascinating to me, because it was a way to educate or provide a tangible experience for the audience to see that they're separate and distinct in my mind, versus a figment of his imagination. And that was really cool to see. Plus, Oscar Isaacs is so phenomenal at that. But
he's nominated for an Emmy, by the way, for that role. Thank God. So really did an amazing job.
Yeah.
It's so subtle too. Aside from that thing that they do where his eyes kind of roll back, the characters themselves, and he talked about, and you can see it. Stephen is a little bit more like curious about the world. He's a little more, what I would say, kind of naive, and and the other guy's seen some crap, and he said literally, like, his eyebrows would go down and he'd have a harsher face when he was being Mark versus Stephen. He said he'd raise his eyebrows, and then watching it the second time, I'm like, oh, there it is. But it was this beautiful, subtle, energetic change. And I see it in people when they're in a group of other people or family members or whoever it is that see them, like really see them for who they are, giving them time to speak. Or mourning the loss of a kid they used to have pre-head injury, but also knowing we can't rewind the clock. What do we do now? How do we be graceful with him now? All those kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, the word that rung in my mind was acceptance. And how hard that is, right? How hard it is to accept the now or the current or whatever it is. You brought up these ideas of like integration. The opposite of integration for us would be compartmentalization, at its extremes. And how, when we talk about all of these concepts, what's so difficult about it is it's not all or nothing. It's not one or the other, right? It's all very nuanced, right? Not that we don't want extreme compartmentalization looks like DID. That's what that is. But that doesn't mean that we don't use compartmentalization as even a therapeutic strategy. Wow, there's a very, scary, anxiety-provoking event that's coming up. How do we compartmentalize that?
Right. It can be a strategy you actually want to teach somebody. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's about conscientious awareness and choice.
Yeah.
Because right in DID, it's not necessarily controlled. It's not like I'm making that conscious choice to, right? It's not until like Mark and Steven get to know each other and they start to tap. They start to tap into each other. Like, you go, okay, fine, you go, right, right. Like, you're better at this than I am, or whatever that is. It's not, because I think DID it's more classically, it's what happens in the beginning, the first episodes versus the last episodes of the show. But like for us, as human beings, that we use some of these, and as long as they're choices, Like
Yeah.
we choose to do that. We
And that's kind
choose
of what
to
I mean by
mask.
control too. And choices
Yeah,
is
yeah,
maybe a
yeah.
better way
That's
to say
right.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a conscientious thing where I'm making a decision based on the fact that I've evaluated a
Mm-hmm.
situation, which is tough if we think about that from a critical thinking or executive functioning standpoint.
Absolutely. Oh my
That's
God.
not the
Yeah.
skills that everybody has
Yeah.
yet or may
Yeah.
not
And those
have.
are kind of meta skills, I think, to pick
Yeah.
up, that I see people that get frustrated because they're not getting that. And I normalize it for them and say, this is a higher order thing and it's going to take a
Yeah.
while. You've spent how many years not doing that? It's going to take X number of
Yeah.
years to undo it. Yeah. And then we have all those cultural presses. I mean, you and I were joking when we first got on. I was telling Dr. Gwen that I got a haircut shorter than I wanted it to be. And while it was happening, I was like, oh my God. And I didn't say anything. So there is not everybody, but there's more of a cultural press for women to not say stuff in situations like that. And so there's all those pieces too that I want to give merit to because they're real and they're heavy and people can judge themselves saying, well, how come I didn't do X, Y, and Z? I've been trying to do that, and say, well, that's a big one. That's a huge stone to push up the hill. And it's going to take some time and keep practicing.
Yeah, we are the product, the culmination of our lived experiences up to this
Mm-hmm,
point.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
if we really want to talk about habit reversal or habit formation, or
Mm-hmm.
as psychologists, we know that the brain is always going to default to the easier thing. That's what it does to survive. So if the pattern, even though it's not healthy, but it's familiar and it's the
Mm-hmm,
easy
mm-hmm.
route, that's where the brain goes. And it's not until we develop something
Of
equal
course.
to or stronger than from a skill or a habit-based
Yeah.
perspective that will go away. And then we know that that neuron itself doesn't even die off. It might
Yeah.
atrophy, but it's still there, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
really speaks to, why addiction's very difficult to kind of
Oh yeah. Or if you're
things like this.
fatigued, the
I
old
know.
way comes
Oh,
back all of a sudden. Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
psychology is not a concrete black and white kind of area, which is why I think
Mm-hmm.
it's fascinated me as a child. It fascinates me today.
Yeah.
And, being able to see the other thing that I loved about Moon Knight is it brought to the mainstream psychology, like mental
Mm.
illness.
Yeah.
And not that I'm trying to say mental illness in a in a derogatory kind of way,
Right. Right.
but
Right. Right.
that DID is serious. It's not
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
but it brings it to this place that is curious
Mm-hmm.
and trying to be accurate and
Yeah.
entertaining in
And like
the
it is what it is. So the judgment piece is out
yeah.
that we've
Yeah.
been talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I like that. I think many of my clients and just being a psychologist for as long as I have, mental health is not something that has gotten that's very sexy.
Right.
It hasn't been
Right.
very
It's
sexy.
still
It might become
stigmatized. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So being able to do that, and I think the other thing about Moon Knight is looking at the relationship differences between Layla and Mark and Layla
Yeah.
and Steven.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's just anyway.
Yeah,
I
I don't want to give away too much, but there's a character named Layla. I won't tell you what the relationship is, but she kind of ends up liking the one that she didn't know before because he's sweeter to
yeah.
her, and then maybe that had been a piece that was missing from Mark, which is really interesting. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a good job of how someone can kind of roll with something. She doesn't believe him at first when he's saying, I don't know who you are. But then she's like, oh, it brings up this idea too. There are core elements of you there that I can still see, regardless of whether you're Mark or Steven, right?
Yep.
And that tends to be pretty accurate in DID too, that there's a core of sort of the base of who that person is. It's present in all the alters typically, right? You just have to know who that is and get that. But yeah, I love that idea of efficacy, or whether you're calling it efficacy or control, and then communicating that to the other. And And how do you manage to swim in the pond you're in without losing your mind in any different way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, amazing. Well, Dana, and for our audience out there, hopefully you like that Dana and I,
Doing something fun.
or enjoyed. Yeah, do something fun. I mean, Dana and I love this kind of lore and mythology, and which is a big reason why we're called the NeuroMarvels. And
Yeah.
so we hope that, and if you liked, for those of you out there, if you liked this episode or you liked our episodes, please leave a comment, give us a rating, give us a thumbs up if you're on YouTube. That really helps us in our channel. And so only if you feel compelled to do so. But if you do, we would appreciate it.
And if always, if you have topic requests, please put them in the comments.
Yeah. And if there's something that resonated with you in regards to the Moon Knight series and what we spoke about, leave it in the comments below. We would love we'll read them and we'll integrate them for sure.
Great.
All right, everyone. See you in the next episode.
Bye.